right, is everybody ready to have some whiskey and a cigar? No smoking in the library, sorry. We're just so thrilled tonight to have President Ulysses S. Grant with us today, or Pete Grady, the gentleman who has researched and created this one-man show portraying the life and times of the Civil War general and 18th president, and if family lore is to be correct, my ancestor. So, Mr. Grady is a retired assistant attorney general for the state of Iowa. No, Mr. Grant. So, yeah, who's buried in Grant's tomb? That's an old joke, isn't it? All right, the presentation today is funded by Humanities Iowa and the State Historical Society Incorporated. The Humanities Iowa is a cultural resource for Iowans since 1971 and brings humanities programs to the heart of Iowa communities. So it is also sponsored by our donors, the Friends Foundation of the West Des Moines Public Library, our fantastic friends at the library who we partner with, and EMC Insurance. So without any further ado, I would like you to welcome President Grant.
Well, hello. I understand we're to have a little visit here today. I am Ulysses S. Grant. And so that there will be no dispute about that, I made certain that the things that you recognize me for are present in front of you, and that is some alcohol, as well as some cigars. Now, I have no longer enjoyed either one of those since my health became precarious. And so perhaps I can prove to you that I can be Ulysses S. Grant without relying on either one of them. But I do recognize that you probably would not recognize me without them here, and so here they are. You seem like a very nice group of people. And as for me, I've had a very nice little visit. So I want to thank you for coming and say that I rise, but only to say I do not intend to say anything. I thank you for your warm welcome and your great good cheer. Thank you. You're still here. I just recited for you a speech that I've given many times in my life. I call it my perfect speech because I find that if I say it with just the right amount of enthusiasm and emotion, that people will begin to clap and cheer, and I may leave the stage without ever having to say another word. But you will not do me that courtesy. You came to see Ulysses S. Grant. Did you come to see Ulysses S. Grant, the world traveler? Or Ulysses S. Grant, the President of the United States? Or Ulysses S. Grant, the Lieutenant General of the Army of the United States? Well, I must plead guilty to being all three, but I also must beg your indulgence, for I have been facing a year of some perilous times. Last May, I found out that a young man who was a business partner of mine in a Wall Street firm of Grant and Ward was a thief. And that as a result of his activities, I've lost all of my money, as well as the money of my friends and relatives and supporters who invested with me. And then shortly after that, I was eating a peach, a peach of all things, and I suddenly experienced a pain in my throat that was devastating. And so I went to see a doctor, and I've seen several very fine doctors, and all of them are unanimous in the determination that I have cancer of the throat, that it is inoperable, and that I am living on about borrowed time. Now, there are those among those doctors who will maintain that the reason that I have throat cancer is from smoking 20 of these a day for 20 years. I am no physician myself, but I'm also in no condition to contradict them. But I have needed a source of income, and just in the recent past, I met with a fellow named Sam Clemens. You may know him as Mark Twain. And Sam, or Mark, is a wonderful writer, as you know, but he is also a publisher. And he came to me and he said that my life has been rather interesting. And as a consequence, it may be the basis for memoirs or an autobiography, and he has asked me to write the same. And he has proposed to me a very generous publishing contract that will certainly guarantee that after my death, despite my my current difficulty with making payments, despite that, I will have more than enough money to care for my wife and my family well into the future. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been working on my memoirs here in New York and finishing them up in Mount McGregor, New York, where they've asked me to go so that I could gain whatever healthful benefits might be there from mountain air. Now, I have just completed discussing my poverty with you, and I think I may have pled it too dramatically because, in truth, within the last 2 or 3 months, I've been very, very fortunate as a new source of income has opened. You see, when I resigned from the United States Army in order to become President of the United States, by my resignation, I forfeited any right I had to a military pension. And of course, there's no such thing as a pension for presidents of the United States. We have pensions for those who serve in the military, but when they resign, they do not qualify anymore. It would take a special act of Congress for me to receive a military pension. But I still have some friends in Congress, and they determined that they were going to come up with a plan whereby the old general might be given a military pension. And the bill was drafted, and it was presented, and it ran into opposition because the opposing party did not want to hear anything about a pension for President Grant or General Grant until a congressional seat was resolved in the state of Iowa. You see, there'd been this election in Iowa, and it was very close, but the winner was a man named Jim Wilson, Tama Jim Wilson, we called him. And Tama Jim won fair and square, but the opposition was not so certain, and they wanted to make certain that their man had a chance at being the member of Congress from central Iowa. And if you can imagine, nothing got done in Congress over this single issue. Back and forth, is that any way to run a deliberative body? But neither side would move until finally Tama Jim Wilson stood up on the floor of the Congress of the United States and said, if the opposition will join me in voting a pension for General Grant, then I will resign my seat in favor of the opponent. And that's what he did. And so as a consequence, my cries of poverty do not quite ring true. For since May of this year, I've been able to receive a military pension. And that has helped my family immeasurably. It's not surprising that someone from Iowa would do something like that. But the Wilson family will not be forgotten by the Grant family. I'm asked to come out here by Mark Twain because he thinks that if I talk with groups that maybe they will be interested in and will actually purchase my book. And I, of course, want you to do that. And it is my sincere hope that as a result of our little visit today, you will become interested in my book, and as a consequence, you will purchase my book, and as a consequence, royalties will flow to my family, and my family will be cared for after my death. But that means that I will have to talk with you. And I do not enjoy speaking. Now, I'm notorious, as it were, for not speaking long And some say it's because I'm shy. And there are those that say that it's because I'm just a naturally quiet fellow. And there are those that say I'm not very bright, don't have much to say. But whether you think I'm shy or quiet or not very bright, the truth of the matter is I've never enjoyed listening to the sound of my own voice. A wise man once said, "It's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt." And that man was Abraham Lincoln. And so I have taken that to heart. And so I think that perhaps, again, I will simply say to you that I rise, but only to say I do not intend to say anything. I thank you for your warm welcome and your great good cheer. Thank you. And you still remain there. Stone-faced. You're afraid there's glue on your hands. You cannot clap them together. I suppose. Oh! Well, I asked you which Ulysses Grant you came to see. When I suggested world traveler, I thought I saw some interest, some sparking eyes. You see, when my wife and I left the White House in 1877, we went on a tour of the world. We went to England. We had tea, Queen Victoria. We met with Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And we had an audience with the Pope. We met the King of Italy. And then we went to the pyramids, and to Syria, and the Holy Land, and then to India, and Siam, and Burma, and China, and even to Japan. When I was in Japan, I was asked by representatives of China and Japan to mediate a dispute between those two countries over the ownership of an island. And I'm proud to say that on behalf of the people of the United States, I was able to mediate that dispute. And as a consequence, those countries did not go to war. They settled it amicably by speaking with one another. And then I returned home to a marvelous, marvelous welcome by people in San Francisco and all across this great country of ours. And of course, I was President of the United States, and I can speak about that very quickly. I received the Republican nomination in 1868, and I was elected in 1868. I was renominated in 1872 and reelected in 1872. And then there's that time before I was president, before I went on my world tour. And that's when I was the Lieutenant General of the Army of the United States, where I was fortunate to be the commander of the Union Army, to help free the enslaved and to save the Union. But on my presidency, not even 10 years out, and already there are those who say that Grant's presidency was a disaster. It was a parade of scandals, and there were scandals. Who can forget the whiskey rings scandal, where men that I appointed to collect taxes from brewers and distillers instead collected bribes, all to the detriment of the Treasury of the United States. And of course, the the Credit Mobilier scandal, the worst scandal that has ever touched American shores, and hopefully the worst that will ever touch American shores, where railroad men and steel interests paid bribes to members of state legislatures and to governors and to members of Congress and senators, even members of presidential administrations. It was a scandal that was so pervasive. It went all the way through state and federal government. It went back through my administration, back through the administration of Andrew Johnson before me, and back to the administration of Abraham Lincoln. I sometimes think I was the only person who didn't receive a bribe and didn't even know that bribing was going on, but it was discovered during my watch. So I got the credit. And even when I would embark upon policy that was designed to improve the economic situation for the people of the United States, all too often those policies were also unsuccessful. There were a fellow named Jay Gould who was a Wall Street financier, and he came up with a plan, a very bright plan, where he could gain a monopoly on gold bullion reserves in the United States and gold futures, effectively create a monopoly on gold. And his notion was very, if you create a monopoly on something like gold, then you can raise the price. And anybody that needs gold to pay their payroll or to do commercial transactions, they're going to have to pay your price, and that excess money, you put it in your pocket. Well, I found out about the scheme because it was a scheme that was designed to take money from American people, and so I ordered my Secretary of the Treasury to go to New York to the open market and sell gold reserves of the United States government on the open market in an effort to flood the market with gold and bring down the price. And it worked. We brought down the price of gold. But we also brought down the price of shipbuilding stocks and steel stocks and banking stocks and real estate stocks, and they all came down, 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 down so fast and so hard, they called it a crash. There's people on Wall Street to this day who still remember what they were doing on Black Friday. But I will say on my own account, and in my administration, we enforced the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States to eliminate slavery in this country. And we enforced the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States to ensure that due process, privileges and immunities were guaranteed to the newly freed slaves so that they could assume their role as American citizens. And I fought for that 14th Amendment so dramatically that I asked Congress to give me a Department of Justice so I could have district attorneys who could bring indictments and seek convictions against members of the Klan and other terrorists throughout the South. And convictions were indeed achieved throughout the South. Many Klansmen went to jail. And as a consequence, many newly freed slaves were able to vote. And in addition to the work under the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment was passed, guaranteeing by constitutional fiat that the newly freed slaves would be able to vote. And with this precious privilege, the newly freed slaves of the South, they registered to vote. They registered to vote, and they voted, and they elected. They elected members of state legislatures and governors and members of Congress and even members of the United States Senate. That's the legacy of the 15th Amendment. But not all the Klansmen were in jail. And they continued to terrorize the South. They continued to engage in mob violence. They continued to engage in murder and assaults and riots
around voting stations and intimidation. And we had federal troops in the South specifically to protect the newly freed slaves. But they couldn't be everywhere all the time. And a single example will suffice. The newly freed slaves of the state of Louisiana were elected to the state legislature. And then as members of the state legislature, they started looking around and asking themselves, what did this state need? And one of the things that the state needed was effective local government, because there had been so many very, very large plantations in the state that the only law was whatever the plantation owner had to say, and no one had any democratic rights to do anything different. And so they looked at the map of Louisiana and they found blank spots where there was no effective government. And so they organized Lincoln Parish, Louisiana. Lincoln Parish. You wonder who that was named after. And then they organized another parish. They called it Grant Parish. That was named after me. And the parish. I just threw out a word there that you folks may not be aware of. In the state of Louisiana, they have a French and Spanish background, a heritage, and so they don't call them counties. They call them parishes. And they don't call it the county seat, they call it the parish capital, or the parish seat. But as I was saying, Grant Parish, Louisiana, it had its own parish seat in a town called Colfax, Louisiana. And Colfax was named after my first vice president, a man named Schuyler Colfax. And the newly freed slaves of Grant Parish, Louisiana, they elected new leaders for their local government, and those new leaders took up their positions in the parish courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana. And the White Liners and the White Leaguers and the Ku Klux Klan determined that this was not going to occur, and so they organized a mob. They organized, essentially, a military campaign against Colfax, Louisiana. And they had sharpshooters, and they even had a small cannon, and they surrounded the courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana, and they ordered the men inside that courthouse to leave. Well, the men inside the courthouse, they looked out and they knew that they were in an untenable position, and so they did put up the white flag. And they came out, and that's when the murder began. And a subsequent congressional investigation said that at least 104 newly freed slaves were murdered that Easter Sunday in Colfax, Louisiana. Of course, we sent the federal troops when we could get them there, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing that they could do except to help locate and bury the dead. And yet, despite this ongoing reign of terror throughout the South, despite these organized efforts to return the newly freed slaves to a condition of slavery, despite this effort to keep them from voting, despite the need for protection and the need for the continuation of federal troops in the South, despite all of that, the very first thing that my successor in office did, Rutherford B. Hayes, as President of the United States, was to remove the federal troops from the South and hand everything back. Everything back. Now, America, over 600,000 men died in a war to save the Union and to eliminate slavery. Over 600,000 men died. Do not allow this country to fall back into the muck of racism. Do not allow it, America. You are better than that. America, we are better than that. But you didn't come here to be yelled at and lectured by me. You came to learn about Ulysses S. Grant. Well, think about that name for just a moment. Ulysses. What a regal name. There was a king in one of the Greek city-states named Ulysses, and they say he was a pretty good king. He was the head of his government. And then he and leaders of some of the other Greek city-states, in fact, mostly all of them, they decided that they had a beef with a city named Troy. And so they organized a league, and together they put together a massive army, and they decided they were going to attack and subdue Troy. And they needed a leader for that army, and they selected this very same man, Ulysses. And Ulysses was successful. After a long and bitter fight, Ulysses was successful. And then he boarded a ship and tried to go home and got lost. And ended up traveling all through the then known world, the Mediterranean, for many years trying to find his way home. Now, isn't that fascinating? Isn't it interesting and in fact omniscient of my parents to name me Ulysses after this great king of old? For just like Ulysses of old, I was the chief magistrate of a great country. And just like Ulysses of old, I commanded a great army. And just like Ulysses of old, I took a trip around the world. Isn't that a wonderful story? And it would be so much better if it was only true. For when, now don't laugh at me, I'm telling you the truth here, for when my parents named me, they didn't name me Ulysses S. Grant. They named me Hiram Ulysses Grant. And when I was a child, my friends called me Hiram. Well, some of them did call me Ulysses as a nickname for Ulysses. And actually, probably more my friends called me Ulysses than called me Hiram. My father picked up on that, though, and he started calling me useless. And, well, he had grounds. You see, my father was a very good businessman. And I've never been accused of being a good businessman. I have never had a mind for business. Well, he recognized that early on. When I was about 8, 9, 10 years old, somewhere in there, I became aware that there was a horse for sale in the neighborhood. A man named Mr. Ralston was selling this horse. And, well, I didn't have my own horse. And every boy needs a horse. Every boy needs a horse, wouldn't you agree? And I didn't have one, and I felt that this was a beautiful horse, and it would fit my needs perfectly. And so I went to my father, and I said, Father, please, 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 will you go to Mr. Ralston and buy this horse for me? And my father says, well, how much is the horse? And I said, oh, Father, it's $25. It's very expensive, but I know that you could do it, and I know that you would do it, and I would be so good with that horse. I would treat it so well. And my father looked down at me and said, you say that it's $25 for that horse? And I said, yes, Father. And my father said, I think maybe you're old enough that you can go buy that horse yourself. And I said, Father, I know nothing about business. I wouldn't know what to do. And my father said, son, all you have to do is learn to negotiate for that horse. Negotiate? What does that mean, Father? He wants $25 for the horse. Is that correct? Yes. Well, offer him $20. Offer him $20 and tell him that this is a cash transaction, cash on the barrelhead. There's no credit involved. He may just sell you that horse for $20. said, but Father, what if he won't sell me the horse for $20? And my father said, in that case, son, offer him $22 and tell him this is a cash transaction. There's no credit involved. He may sell you the horse for $22. And I said, Father, what if he won't sell me the horse for $22? And my father said, well, in that case, son, just give the man $25. So my father gave me $25. And that is a princely sum. And I had that gripped to my chest, and I went to see Mr. Ralston. And I said, Mr. Ralston, Mr. Ralston, I'm here to buy the horse. And Mr. Ralston looked down at me and says, What? You're too young to be out here conducting business. Does your father even know you're here? And I said, yes, he does. He not only knows I'm here, he taught me how to negotiate for the horse. Well, what did your father tell you? He told me to offer you $20 for that horse, and if you wouldn't take that, to offer you $22, and if you didn't take that, to offer you $25. Well, Mr. Ralston sold me that horse for $25. And so you can see that my father calling me useless might be justified, but he did see enough in me to think I might make a military man. And so he contacted Thomas L. Hamer, our member of Congress, and asked Congressman Hamer to recommend me for appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Now, Congressman Hamer, he was agreeable, but there was a problem because Congressman Hamer, although he knew my father, of course, he knew my mother's family better than he knew the Grant family. And my mother's maiden name was Simpson. And so Congressman Hamer, instead of recommending Hiram Ulysses Grant, he recommended Ulysses Simpson Grant to the United States Military Academy. See, he took my middle name, made it my first name, took my mother's maiden name, made it my middle name, took my first name, and kind of made it disappear. And when I showed up at the United States Military Academy, I said, Hiram Ulysses Grant, reporting, and they said, we don't have a Hiram Ulysses Grant, we have a Ulysses Simpson Grant. Are you Ulysses Simpson Grant? And I said, yes, sir, and I learned right there that when the United States Army tells you what your name is, that's what your name is. So the next day, out on the parade ground, the drill sergeant yells out, attention, U.S. Grant! And from way down on the other side of the parade ground, this Western Ohio accented voice yells out, U.S. Grant! Uncle Sam Grant! Hey boys, Uncle Sam's here at the academy. Well, tell us about yourself, Sam. And that's what they called me at the academy and in the Army. I was now Sam Grant. And that's what people knew me as, Sam Grant. Oh, and that voice, it belonged to a man named William Tecumseh Sherman. Oh, you recognize that? Yes, that same man who took the Army of the Tennessee and broke through Georgia and through the Carolinas, broke the Eastern Confederacy in half, and brought that war to a conclusion at least 1 and maybe 2 years sooner than it otherwise would have. But in those days, he was just a friend. William Tecumseh Sherman was a very bright young man. He graduated 4th in his class at the United States Military Academy. I did not graduate that high, but I graduated. And oh, was I proud. Was I proud. I went back to my father's home in Ohio, and I had purchased the finest military uniform I could buy. And I took the finest horse out of his stable, and I decided it would be right for me to ride that horse around the neighborhood in full dress uniform, just to show the folks how far young Grant had come. And as I was riding around the neighborhood, some would say promenading, I noticed there was a little boy standing by the side of the road. There was a mud puddle there, and there was almost more mud on him than there was in the puddle. His pant legs were all cut off. He was barefoot. His hair was unkempt, shall we say. And he had a shirt on him that was so filthy, I swear it never saw the inside of a wash tub. And he looked up at me and he said, "Oh, look at you. Oh, you look so pretty up there, Mr. Soldier. You look so pretty up there, Mr. Soldier. Well, I got a question for you, Mr. Soldier. Will you ever work? Will you ever do one lick of work?" And then he took off this filthy shirt and he spun it around his head and he said, "I will sell this shirt for good money before you ever do one lick of work." Well, that little boy taught me something, and that is that it's not fine uniforms, pressed white shirts that make a soldier. No, it's grit, it's determination, it's willingness to see a cause through to the end. You may recall that when I met with General Lee at Appomattox in 1865, the newspapers were full of stories about how elegantly dressed General Lee appeared. And he was elegantly dressed, and his sword was shined, and his boots were gleaming. And I, on the other hand, had mud. When you go through a war like I went through, unfortunately, images of blood spring to mind way too often. I had mud on my boots and on my pants, and I had a private's overshirt on. All they could see was my 3 stars. So yes, General Lee was very elegantly dressed. But I seem to recall that the well-dressed general surrendered to the one who was not so well-dressed. I graduated West Point, and I was stationed at a place called Jefferson Barracks, St. Louis, Missouri. Now, I had a roommate at West Point named Frederick Dent. And Fred Dent was a good man as well as being my roommate, and he was born and raised on a farm outside of St. Louis, Missouri. So when I was stationed there, as soon as I had any liberty at all, the first thing I did was to ride out to Fred's house and meet Fred's family. And I found out very quickly that Fred was not the only attraction out there. Fred had a younger sister named Miss Julia. And Miss Julia and I, we had a nice little chat. We greeted one another. And of course, the visit had to end, and so I got back on my horse and I went back to Jefferson Barracks. But later that week, I found an occasion to have to go back out to the Dent farm, and so I did, and I was able to, see Miss Julia again, and again, we had an opportunity to chat. And later that month, there was another need for me to ride out to the Dent farm. And, well, the simple truth is that the joke around Jefferson Barracks was that Grant didn't have to guide the horse out to the Dent farm. The horse knew how to get there all by itself. And that's because Miss Julia and I were in love. And oh, we made plans. We made plans. But then war interrupted those plans. And this was a war we should not have fought. This was a war that was fought for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to take land from a neighbor. To go backwards just a little bit, there was a country named Mexico that had a province in the northeast part of Mexico, and that province was called Texas. And the law of Mexico was that they had no slavery. Slavery was illegal. But Americans started to move into Texas with slaves and insisted on imposing slavery in Mexico. And when the Mexican authorities objected, those Americans determined that they were going to revolt to protect their institution of slavery, and that's what they did. They had a revolution, and they won. And they became the Republic of Texas, and then they spun around so fast and went to the United States and said, we'd like to be admitted as a state. And the United States said, no, thank you. No, thank you. We are in no position to admit another slave state. We have a balance in the United States Senate. And a treaty was even drawn up between the country of Texas and the country of the United States, and the American Senate refused to ratify that treaty. And so there was no joinder. It did not become a state until a president named John Tyler decided, well, we don't need to go through the treaty route. We will simply annex Texas, and that's what he did. And so the Texas annexation went forward, and all of a sudden Texas was part of the United States of America. And once Texas became part of the United States of America, the border between Texas and Mexico now became the border between the United States of America and Mexico. And that border was in dispute. There was a disagreement as to where the line was. The Mexican government said that the proper line of demarcation between these two countries was a river called the Rio Nueces River. And it rises in the southwest and flows down and ultimately empties to the southeast in the Gulf of Mexico. And the Americans said, oh, no, no, the proper border is a river called the Rio Grande River, which is several miles south of the Rio Nueces River. And so you had a strip of land that was in dispute between these two countries. Now, when you have land that's in dispute between two countries, one way to resolve it is to negotiate, have ambassadors talk, or maybe even bring in someone like I was, between Japan and China. A disinterested third party, but not the President of the United States. No. We had a President of the United States named James K. Polk who ran with the platform of seizing as much land as possible for the United States of America. He was real clear about it, that he wanted land to the south from Mexico and he wanted land to the north from Great Britain, and he was willing to do just about anything. And so what he did was he ordered the United States Army to cross the Rio Nueces into the disputed land, knowing as he did so that when the Mexican government saw the United States Army coming, they would see it as an invading force and that they would try to stop it, and that people would be killed. And once that happened, James K. Polk went to the Congress of the United States, and he told the Congress of the United States that he needed a declaration of war against Mexico because, as he said, American blood has been spilled on American soil. Now, there were some in Congress who said, well, we agree, Mr. President, that if indeed American blood has been spilled on American soil, then we need to respond forcefully, and perhaps a declaration of war is appropriate. But please, Mr. President, before we send our young men to fight in a foreign land, could you please point to a spot on the map where this outrage occurred? Now, President Polk didn't listen to that, and it was put forward by some pretty radical members of Congress. There was a fellow from the state of Illinois, Congressman Abraham Lincoln. He argued that they needed to show a spot on the map, and people laughed at him. They called him Spotty Lincoln. He was just Spotty Lincoln. And so that was the only elective office, federal elective office, that Abraham Lincoln held before he was elected President of the United States. So we went to war. And that's why I had to leave Julia. And I was part of the Army, and well, this is Iowa that we're in, is that right? One thing I've learned is you don't have to tell the people of Iowa about the Mexican War. The people of Iowa know more about the Mexican War than anyone else in the entire United States, because they memorialized the war on their map. You've named counties after some of the great generals of the war, like General Worth and General Butler, and of course Winfield Scott, Scott County, and Zachary Taylor, Taylor County, even John C. Fremont, Fremont County. Oh, and you have counties named after great battles of that war. You have a county named Palo Alto County, and Buena Vista County, and Cerro Gordo County. But more important than any of those county names, you have counties named after young men who were killed in that war. And I have to plead my age and some failing eyesight. And I may have to plead failing memory too, because I can't find my glasses. But I can tell you that you have a Clay County named after Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay, Jr., the son of the great Senator Henry Clay, who ran for president. You have a county named after Major Frederick Mills, after Colonel John Hardin, after Samuel Ringgold, Captain Edwin Guthrie, and one that is especially meaningful to me was Captain John Page, for I was present when he received his fatal wounds. Now, the good people of Iowa have honored these young men on a daily basis. They are honored today, and they will be honored through the centuries. So people will not forget their sacrifice in this war. Oh, and of course you have a Polk County too, because even the devil got his due. We ended the war, and I returned to St. Louis, Missouri, and Miss Julia and I were married. And then I started on a career in the United States Army. I was stationed in Detroit, and then I was sent to upstate New York, and then I was sent to the frontier of all frontiers, the Great Northwest, where there was very little of civilization beyond that civilization that Native Americans were able to impose on the land. And it was lonely. I asked my wife to go back to St. Louis and be with her folks. She was pregnant with our second child. The Northwest was no place for her. And I went there and I found something that all young soldiers learn at some point in their life. And that is that the mail does not come as often or as regularly as you wish that it did. And I was lonely and alone, and I started to drink. Now, as I said at the beginning, there are those who only recognize me because of drink. There are those who say, oh, Grant was a terrible drinker, just a lush. Grant was drunk all the time. That's not possible to be drunk all the time. And the other thing is that I ran for president twice, so you can imagine that perhaps some of those claims are a bit amplified by political rhetoric. But having said that, I can't deny that I began to drink. I was kind of afflicted with an overwhelming, debilitating melancholy. And so I drank. You know, when President Lincoln was considering promoting me, one of his civilian advisors said, "Oh, Mr. President, you cannot promote Grant. Grant's a drinker. He's a terrible drinker." And Lincoln said, "That's right. He's also a fighter. We need to find out what kind of whiskey he drinks and send a barrel to the rest of my generals." And despite the levity, I have to appreciate the president for what he had to say, because, yes, I was a drinker. I regret that. I'm fortunate that I live with Julia, for she does not put up with it. But I regret that. I wonder how much better the life of this country and the life of my family would be if I had not awakened so many days staring at the world through the fog of alcohol. As I said, I resigned the United States Army, and I returned to St. Louis, Missouri, to see if I could make a living as a farmer. And I farmed, and I failed as a farmer. I was a terrible farmer. And then I got a job with a real estate company. It was my job to collect rents. But I didn't have the heart for collecting rents. I didn't hold that job very long. And then I learned that there was an opening at the county government level for a county surveyor. And I thought, I'm sorry, not a surveyor, an engineer, county engineer. And I thought with my training and my facility with mathematics that I picked up at the United States Military Academy, that I would be a perfect candidate for that job. And so I applied for that job, and they gave that job to someone else. And so, in order to put food on the table, I needed to raise money somehow. So I started to cut down trees and split wood and cut it into pieces of firewood, and I would bundle it together and put it on a cart and go through the streets of St. Louis, Missouri, selling firewood to people. And that's where I was in 1859 when my father wrote to me and asked me to come to Galena, Illinois, to be part of a leather goods business that he had established there. Now, I will say it is not easy for a middle-aged man to have to admit that he has been a failure in civilian life and that he needs the help of his father to care for his family, but it's also significant that it is the duty of a middle-aged man to do just that. And so I swallowed whatever pride I had, and I went to Galena, Illinois, and I began to help with a leather goods business and a tannery that we had established there in Galena. And that's where I was during the presidential election of 1860. Now, I didn't vote in the election of 1860. I had left the state of Missouri, so I couldn't vote there. And I hadn't lived in Illinois long enough to meet the residency requirements, so I couldn't vote there. But I watched that election very, very carefully. And when Abraham Lincoln won that election, oh, the brave men of the South, they said they would not stand to have Abraham Lincoln President of the United States. We shall not put up with Abraham Lincoln as the President of the United States. We shall secede from the Union. We shall secede from the Union. And there was a man named Jefferson Davis that stood in front of a convention in the state of Mississippi and said, Abraham Lincoln will not fight. The North will not fight. I personally guarantee they will not. I personally will drink every drop of blood that is spilled south of the Mason-Dixon line. Well, Jefferson Davis was a fool. Now remember that all of those states that seceded, except a few toward the end, seceded before Abraham Lincoln was even President of the United States. They had a free and fair election, elected someone. What do? They decide they're going to revolt against it. And they rebel against it. And as a consequence, we were two armed camps. But Abraham Lincoln did not fire the first shot. Abraham Lincoln said, I will support my squadron in South Carolina. I will resupply them. They will not start a fight. But the South said, oh, yeah, they sent the orders to P.T. Beauregard and said, reduce Fort Sumter. And he did just that. And so in April of 1861, the South opened warfare on the Union. And when that happened, Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers to come forward and save the Union. He sent out a request, come, join the Army. And the recruiting halls in the North were overflowing with men who came forward to fight for this sacred Union of ours. That's when I rejoined the Army of the United States. That's when I began, yet again, to serve the United States of America. And I served this country. I served this country with the men of the United States Army and the United States Navy, and together we were able to save the Union, to defend democracy. Now, there are friends of ours from the South that say, well, Union didn't win the war, the South won the war. Well, they know they're fooling themselves there. But what they do say is, they say, if this one soldier had just done this one thing a little different in that one battle, why, then we would have won that battle. And if we won that battle, why, we would have won that campaign. And if we had won that campaign, we would have won the war. And as I said, there were some that even they convinced themselves that they had won the war. But, oh well, if they didn't win the war, at least they were gentlemen and they decided to end the bloodshed, as gentlemen would. No. The South did not win the war. The Union won the war. The United States of America won the war. The Union won the war. The Union won the war, and the Union remains strong. When our friends in the South look at the 34 stars on this flag, what do they see? Do they say, oh, there's Georgia, and oh, there's Louisiana, or oh, there's Iowa, or there's Illinois? No, you can't tell which star is which state, because the stars are not important. What's important is the constellation. What's important is the field. What's important is the Union. The Union won the war. The Union won the war. And the Union remains strong. Now, I myself know some details about that war, but I won't be able to share them with you today, because then you would have no incentive to buy my book. And you may chuckle, but I need you to buy my book. For that's the only way that my wife and family will be cared for after my death. But well, perhaps I gave you some morsels. You might be interested enough to not only purchase the book yourself, but also maybe even buy an extra copy for a family member or a friend. Recommend it to your neighbors. Let me share just a few notes. I was in the West. I was stationed at a place called Cairo, Illinois, right at the tip of Illinois. And right below us, there were two rebel forts. One was called Fort Henry, and it was on the Tennessee River. And one was called Fort Donelson, and Fort Donelson was on the Cumberland River. And those two rebel forts needed to be taken care of. And so I worked with a man named Andrew Foote of the United States Navy, and together we agreed upon a joint military operation to take those two forts out of action. So we started on down, and the Navy got there first. They gave some of us rides, and we disembarked, and then they went ahead and they started firing on Fort Henry, and they just reduced Fort Henry to nothing. We didn't have to do anything in the United States Army. By the time we got there, there was nothing left, and the remaining soldiers from there, they had left and gone on to the other fort on the Cumberland River. So the Navy went on ahead again. They'd had such great luck with Fort Henry that they decided they were going to do the same thing to Fort Donelson, and they went onto the Cumberland River, and they started firing at Fort Donelson, and Fort Donelson was another kettle of fish. Fort Donelson had a commanding view of the river, and it was well armed, and they started to lob shells at the United States Navy, and frankly, the United States Navy was bruised up pretty badly. There were men on ships that were killed as a result of that, and ships that were destroyed as a result of that. And oh, the rebels in Fort Donelson, they were up on top of the ramparts cheering this great victory, and then one of them stopped to think and turn around and look, and what was on the lanyard side of that fort but the United States Army. And they saw us out there, and they thought, oh, we are in danger of being encircled. We are in danger of being put to siege. And so we better do something. And so they launched an attack from inside the fort, attempting to break through. And it was some sharp fighting, but the United States Army managed to fight them back and push them back into the fort. And then they had to make some decisions. There were three generals in that fort. There was a man named John Floyd, a man named Gideon Pillow, and a man named Simon Bolivar Buckner. Now, John Floyd, you of course remember him. He was the Secretary of War under James Buchanan, and as soon as Abraham Lincoln won the war, John Floyd started moving guns and armaments from northern arsenals to the south. The man who was the Secretary of War, who was the head of the United States Army, started to give armaments that would be used to kill United States soldiers to the enemy of the United States of America. That's John Floyd. John Floyd knew that if I captured him, I would hang him. And so he decided maybe he didn't want to be caught. And so he signed off his commission and handed the command of the fort over to a man named Gideon Pillow. Now, Gideon Pillow, you may know some people like Gideon Pillow. Gideon Pillow, well, if you asked him who the greatest man that ever was born would be, he would probably say Gideon Pillow. He had an opinion of himself that, well, I knew him, and I still can't believe he had that opinion of himself, but he did. And he decided that, well, first of all, he knew that it was going to be necessary to surrender this fort. And whoever surrendered it would just go down in history as, a terrible loser. And he determined that if he was the surrendering general, why, the morale of the people of the South would just be devastated. They would decide that if Gideon Pillow gave up that fort, well, then there's nothing left for us to live for. And so out of the goodness of his heart, he signed off to Simon Bolivar Buckner. And then he and Floyd and a couple of other scallywags snuck away in the middle of the night. And the next morning, folks inside that fort woke up, they looked out, they had a new commander, Simon Bolivar Buckner, but things had not changed. We were still there. In fact, there were more of us, and we were closer. And they knew they only had one option, and that was to surrender the fort. And so Simon Bolivar Buckner, he sat down and he wrote a note to me. And I sure hope my arms are long enough because I still have not found my glasses. There we go. Simon Bolivar Buckner wrote to me, and and I have to apologize for the fragility of this this document, but I frankly have taken it out and looked at it many times in my life. And one of the things that will happen when you buy a copy of my book, there will be a perfect facsimile of this in the book, in the original handwriting. So that's just another reason to buy the book. But he wrote to me, "Sir, in consideration of all the circumstances governing the present situation of affairs at this station, I propose to the commanding officer of the federal forces the appointment of commissioners to agree upon terms of capitulation of the forces and fort under my command. And in that view, I suggest an armistice until 12 o'clock today." To which I replied, "Sir, yours of this date, proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am very respectfully your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General." To which I received the following reply: "Sir, the distribution of forces under my command, incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose." And so Fort Donelson and 17,000 rebel soldiers surrendered to this ungenerous and unchivalrous fellow you see standing in front of you. And that's when they started calling me Unconditional Surrender Grant. Oh, they called me other things. They called me a butcher. They called me a vainglorious criminal. And at Cold Harbor, they called me a murderer. I will speak to you of Cold Harbor. I do so not to attempt to relieve any responsibility from my shoulders, but rather to try to convince you that of all means to settling disputes, war is always the least desirable alternative. For war takes young men to places like Cold Harbor, where the last thing they see is the mocking face of death. Cold Harbor. And it didn't have to happen. It did not have to happen. If at the Battle of Gettysburg, General George Meade had immediately followed General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia and captured them before they were able to get to the South, then the war in the East would have been over. But General Meade decided, like a lot of previous commanders of the Army of the Potomac, he decided his men needed a rest. And so they rested. And while they rested, General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were able to escape and live to fight another day. Now, I was not at Gettysburg. I said I was in the West. I told you about Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. And then, of course, there was Shiloh. Shiloh. It was brutal. More men died at Shiloh than had died in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined in a 2-day battle. That was Shiloh. There was a meadow at Shiloh where you stood at one tree line and you could look over to the tree line on the other side of the meadow, and then if you were so disposed, you could walk across that meadow, just stepping on bodies of dead soldiers. Your feet wouldn't touch the ground. That was Shiloh. Shiloh did spur something very important, though, and that was Shiloh brought to the North a realization of the need to care for the soldiers and provide sanitation and provide medical care. And women throughout the North organized what were called sanitary commissions. And as a result of their work, many, many, many young men were saved. I've told you that 600,000 men died, but for the women of the sanitary commissions, 700,000, 800,000. Thank goodness we will never know. So I fought through Shiloh, and then, of course, the siege of Vicksburg, and then the defense of Chattanooga, and then, in March of 1864, President Lincoln nominated me to be Lieutenant General of the Army of the United States and give me command of the strategy of the United States. And I was only the second Lieutenant General ever in the history of the United States Army, and the first was George Washington. And I was given command, and it was my responsibility to create a strategy to win this war. And that's precisely what we did. First of all, we had to get rid of the blockade runners. And so Admiral Farragut was able to successfully invade and shut down Mobile, Alabama, and all of the goods that were coming in there to supply the Confederate armies. And then we had a very large Confederate army in the southeast, and thank goodness the Union had William Tecumseh Sherman and the Army of Tennessee. For the plan there was simply to break the southeast apart and destroy that army. And he was able to do that. And that was my job to fight General Lee, the Army of Northern Virginia, defeat that army, and capture the Confederate capital at Richmond. And so in May of 1864, we started to march with the Army of the Potomac. And we met the enemy at a place called the Wilderness. It was an area of rocks and trees and swamps and gullies and a completely untenable place to engage in warfare. Hand-to-hand combat. Warfare so brutal that firing salvos would cause the trees to light. And as a result, I have been told that more men may have died being burned to death or dying from too much smoke than actually were killed by enemy action. That was the Wilderness. It was devastating. It was a horrific battle. And after we survived that battle, I know that the men of the Army of the Potomac thought, well, here we go again. We're going to rest while General Lee goes and retools. But instead, I rode to the front lines, and I saw the men around their cook fires, and I said, boys, don't get too comfortable. We're going to go after them again tomorrow. We're going to go after them again tomorrow. We're going to assault them. We're going to go on to Richmond. And those men of the Army of the Potomac, who so often had fought so bravely and then had been called to rest while the enemy rebuilt. Those men looked at me. They didn't know me. I was from the West. They looked at me, and they stood up, and they started to cheer. They started to cheer because they knew that I was going to put this madness to an end. And so we began to push the Army of Northern Virginia. Oh, and they pushed back, of course, but we pushed the Army of Northern Virginia. And they pushed back, but we pushed harder, and we pushed the Army of Northern Virginia, and we pushed them, and we pushed them until they reached a place called Cold Harbor, where they decided they were not going to be pushed anymore. And they dug trenches, and they put together a very fortified line of defense with sharpshooters and mortars. And I saw that line, and I thought, this is it. This is it. One assault will go directly at the middle of that line. We will break through that line. We will capture General Lee. We will move on to Richmond, and we will win this war. And so I ordered my men into a frontal assault on that fortified line. And those brave men, they wrote their names on pieces of paper. They put them on the back of their uniforms because they knew what was coming. And when we gave the order to charge, they bravely did just that. And then they started to go down like dominoes, like human dominoes. And the slaughter was horrific. And I saw what was happening, and I immediately gave an order to stop the assault. And then I went to General Lee, and I asked General Lee to give us an armistice so that we could send unarmed litter bearers between the lines to pick up the wounded soldiers and take them back for medical care. And General Lee wrote back that he didn't think that he was going to agree to that. And the cries of the men between the lines was horrific, and I wrote again to General Lee, again requesting that he allow us to send unarmed litter bearers under white flags between the lines to pick up the wounded men, and again General Lee determined that would not be appropriate. And this back and forth writing went on for 48 hours, and during that 48 hours, the cries of the men became quieter and quieter, and finally they just became moans, and then finally there was silence on the battlefield. And when General Lee finally determined that it would be appropriate to send unarmed litter bearers between the lines to pick up the wounded men, we found 4 men still alive. 4 men. Between 9 and 13,000 men died in that assault. 9 and 13,000, whose wives and mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and friends, they will never forget the words Cold Harbor. There was a rebel sharpshooter who said simply, this was bloody work. And a rebel officer said, this isn't war anymore, this is murder. And that's why they called me a murderer. Of course, we held fast, and we were able to push more, and we finally captured General Lee, and we captured Richmond. And I met with General Lee at a place called Appomattox. And I thought about that little boy by the side of the road where he taunted me. He said, will you work? Will you ever work? And I thought, yes, I worked. And so now I sit here in Mount McGregor and try to work on my memoirs. The air is very pleasant, but I'm very ill. And the work can be tedious and difficult. But one unlooked for enjoyment
is that many friends have come to visit me. Just within the past couple of weeks, I had a visit from a fellow named Simon Bolivar Buckner. Perhaps you remember that name. That was a man that I humiliated, absolutely humiliated, by demanding unconditional surrender at Fort Donelson. But I didn't tell you that he was a friend of mine. I didn't tell you that we knew each other from West Point, that we had worked together, fought together in the Mexican War, that after the end of hostilities in Mexico, when we were no longer fighting, but we were an army of occupation, he and I had some liberty time, and so we went on a little tour together of the volcanoes of Mexico. He even wrote a little book about it. And then in 1854, when I resigned my commission with the United States Army, I found myself in the city of New York with no money. And who lent me money to get home but Simon Bolivar Buckner? Well, he came to visit me, and it was one of these days when my throat cancer was treating me very poorly. And as a consequence, I was not really able to talk. But he could talk. He was always a talker. And he would talk, and I would write a response. And he would talk, and I would write a response. And my boys are up here at Mount McGregor helping me with this manuscript. And seems it's hard to write on any scrap of paper without them grabbing onto it and making sure that it's saved for the book. But I have one sheet I want to share with you. I told Simon Bolivar Buckner that I have witnessed since my sickness just what I wished to see ever since the war. Harmony and good feelings between the sections. I've always contended that if there had been no one left except the soldiers, we would have had peace within a year. We may now look forward to perpetual peace at home and a national strength that will secure us against any foreign complication. I believe myself that the war was worth all that it cost us, as fearful as that was. For since it was over, I have visited every state in Europe and a number in the East. And I know now, as I did not know before, the value of our inheritance as Americans. I will die soon. I know that. And all of you good people that are there, sitting listening to me, you too will die. For all of us face an unconditional surrender, where no matter what we have to say, death will visit us. But I have a condition before I die. I have a condition before I die. I will not die until I complete my book, so my wife and family will be cared for after my death. And now I must go back to my book. And so I say to you once again, and for the last time, that I rise, but only to say that I will not say anything more. I thank you for your warm welcome and your great good cheer. Thank you very much.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Grady. We take December off. Our next Iowa Files will be Sunday, July 21st. Selena Beniaz was one of the last survivors from Schindler's List and the only one who graduated from North High School and Grinnell College in Iowa. So Sandy Yoder, who's the director of the Iowa Jewish Historical Society, will share Selena's story. So I hope you join us. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and thanks to sponsors and donors for making the Iowa Files possible.